Saving his life was the most dangerous mistake Angela Moya would ever make. Because the man rubbing his left arm in seat 1A wasn't just a high-net-worth passenger. He was the iron architect of a sprawling criminal empire. He was part of the Korean Mafia. And the moment Angela decided to perform a clinical sabotage of his itinerary by forcing an emergency landing, she unknowingly tied her fate to his enemies, his bloodline, and a world where mercy is seen as a fatal detail. Before we go any further, I want to know who is joining our global family today. Drop your city or country in the comments, and if you're ready to see how a single act of immovable grace can trigger a status collapse in the underworld, hit that subscribe button. 30,000 feet above Denver, the air in first class held a calculating quiet. Most people would have missed the slight wince on the passenger's face, but Angela possessed a waitress's eye for detail born from tragedy. She had lost her father to a heart attack back in Harare, and she had memorized the symptoms like a prayer for an unburdened future. The man in 1A, Hyan-Woo, was young and possessed a lethal calm that seemed to anchor the cabin. His suit likely cost more than her annual salary, and his assistant, Sun-Young, sat across from him with a disciplined vigilance, focused entirely on a laptop, oblivious to the signals of a failing heart. Angela moved closer, her own heart beating with a frantic, rhythmic tension. "Sir, are you feeling all right?" Hyan-Woo looked up, his god complex flashing like icy malice in his dark eyes. "I'm fine," he snapped. But his face had gone a chilling pale gray, and sweat beaded along a hairline that suggested a looming status collapse. "Your arm," she pressed, her voice a precision instrument of professional duty, ignoring Sun-Young's glare. "Does it hurt?" "I said I'm fine," he growled, but as he spoke, his hand snapped toward his chest in a shadow's reflex of pure, unadulterated pain. Angela knew then that the anatomy of a lie was over. The emergency landing was no longer an option, it was an absolute finality. The recovery room at Denver Memorial was a masterpiece of clinical sterility, a world of white-tiled floors and humming monitors that felt like a hospital noose to a man who lived his life in the vast, open shadows of the underworld. Hyan-Woo lay in the center of the bed, his chest rising and falling with a rhythmic tension that betrayed the trauma his heart had just endured. He didn't move. He didn't call for a nurse. He remained in a state of lethal calm, his dark eyes fixed on the ceiling, performing a silent audit of the situation. To the medical staff, he was just a high-net-worth patient with an expensive suit and a mysterious entourage. They didn't see the iron architect beneath the hospital gown. They didn't see the fury that was currently performing a clinical sabotage on his recovery. Hyan-Woo wasn't angry at the heart attack. Nature was a variable even he couldn't fully delete. He was furious that a nobody had witnessed his status collapse. A flight attendant. A woman whose name he hadn't even registered. She had looked at his god complex and seen only a failing organ. She had ignored his icy malice and forced an emergency landing that had broadcasted his vulnerability to every rival in the grit and grease of the global underworld. By saving his life, she had unknowingly committed a fatal detail of disrespect that required an absolute finality. The door to the private suite opened with a whisper of disciplined vigilance. Sun-Young stepped inside, his face a mask of neutral efficiency. He didn't speak until the door clicked shut, sealing them in a calculating quiet. "The news of the landing has reached the council in Seoul," Sun-Young reported, his voice a low vibration. "They are calling it a momentary lapse. But Sang-Jun is already using the signals to suggest your foundation is cracking. He is painting this rescue as a sign that the Iron Architect is no longer unshakable." Hyan-Woo's fingers curled into the white bedsheets, his knuckles turning a chilling pale gray. "The woman," he said, the words a low, dangerous growl. "The one who saw too much. Find her. I want an audit of her life before the sun sets." "She is still in Denver," Sun-Young replied, his waitress's eye for detail noting the slight elevation in Hyan-Woo's heart rate on the monitor. "She's at a crew hotel near the airport. She believes she's just going back to her life, oblivious to the fact that she's now a variable in your anatomy of power." Hyan-Woo looked toward the window, where the Denver skyline was swallowed by a chilling pale gray dusk. He could still feel the phantom sensation of her hand on his arm, a moment of immovable grace that had stopped his heart from failing even as it shattered his pride. She was a vulnerable giant who had dared to touch a god, and in his world, that required a reckoning. "She thinks she saved me," Hyan-Woo whispered into the sterile silence. "She doesn't realize she just tied her fate to a world that does not forgive. She performed a clinical sabotage on my reputation to keep me breathing. Now I will perform an audit on her bravery to see if she's worth the life she saved." The calculating quiet of the hospital room felt heavy, a blueprint for a physical ascent that Angela Moya would never see coming. Hyan-Woo closed his eyes, his lethal calm settling over him like a sovereign seal. The hospital noose was temporary, but the debt he owed the flight attendant was an absolute finality. He would find her, and when he did, the anatomy of a lie that she was just a bystander would be erased forever. The reckoning had already begun. The calculating quiet of the Denver hotel suite was a far cry from the pressurized hum of the first-class cabin, yet for Angela Moya, the air felt just as thin. She stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker through a chilling pale gray evening mist, her hands steady as she performed a mental audit of the situation. She knew that saving a man like Hyan-Woo wasn't an act that ended with a hospital discharge. It was a sovereign debt that had already begun to rewrite her life's blueprint. The knock at the door didn't startle her. It was a rhythmic, heavy sound, a precision instrument of announcement rather than a request for entry. When she opened it, she wasn't met by hotel security or a fellow crew member. She was met by the disciplined vigilance of two men in charcoal suits, their expressions a mask of icy malice that suggested they were used to being the final variable in someone else's equation. "Angela Moya," the taller one stated. It wasn't a question. It was an absolute finality. They moved into the room without invitation, their presence casting a shadow behind the curtain over the modest space. Most people in Angela's position would have succumbed to a status collapse, offering pleas or trembling under the weight of their lethal calm. But Angela had spent a lifetime mastering invisibility by design, and she had learned that when the world tries to make you small, you must become a vulnerable giant. "I've already given my statement to the airline and the medical board," Angela said, her voice a low vibration of immovable grace. She didn't retreat. She stood her ground, her posture a precision fit for the uniform she still wore. "If Hyan-Woo's recovery is in question, you should be at the hospital, not here." The enforcers exchanged a glance, a shadow's reflex of surprise. They had expected a victim. They found a woman performing a silent audit of their own strength. "Our employer doesn't care about statements," the second man countered, his voice like grit and grease against the quiet of the room. "He cares about the anatomy of a silence. You saw the Iron Architect at his point of failure. In our world, that is a fatal detail that usually requires liquidation." He stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the floor like a hospital noose. But Angela didn't flinch. She thought of her father, of the prayers she had memorized to never forget the symptoms of a dying man. She had acted out of a sovereign duty to humanity, and she refused to let their God complex turn her mercy into a crime. "You can tell Hyan-Woo that I didn't see a Mafia boss in seat 1A, she whispered, her gaze locking onto theirs with an iron-forged resolve. "I saw a man whose heart was failing. I performed a clinical sabotage on death, not on his reputation. If he wants to silence me for that, then he is a smaller man than the one I saved." The room plunged into a pressurized silence. The enforcers, who lived in a world where fear was the only currency, seemed momentarily bankrupt. They were witnessing Immovable Grace in its purest form, a woman who was unburdened by the terror they tried to project. "He wants to see you," the tall one finally said, his tone shifting from a threat to a reluctant audit of respect. "Not to silence you. Not yet. He wants to see the woman who thinks she has the right to judge the Iron Architect." "Then he knows where I am," Angela replied, her voice remaining a precision instrument of calm. As they turned to leave, The calculating quiet returned to the suite, but the atmosphere had changed. The anatomy of a lie, that she was just a helpless bystander, had been dismantled. Angela Moyo had survived the first reckoning, but she knew the signals were clear. Her physical ascent into Hyan-Woo's dark world was no longer avoidable. It was a destiny she had claimed the moment she chose to save a god. The calculating quiet of the hotel suite was shattered not by a sound, but by a shift in the air's pressure. Hyan-Woo entered with a lethal calm that seemed to absorb the light from the room, his presence an iron-forged weight that made the walls feel suddenly narrow. He was no longer the vulnerable giant clutching his chest in seat 1A. He was the iron architect of the Valente legacy, his sharp features set in a mask of icy malice. Angela stood by the small desk, her posture a masterpiece of immovable grace. She didn't retreat as he crossed the threshold. She didn't offer the status collapse he expected from a woman whose life was now a paper gamble in his hands. Instead, she met his gaze with a disciplined vigilance that seemed to perform a silent audit of his own recovery. "You should be in a cardiac recovery ward," she said, her voice a precision instrument of calm that cut through his intimidating silence. "Not stalking through hotel corridors in the middle of a Denver winter." Hyan-Woo stopped a few feet from her, his chilling pale gray eyes narrowing. He had come here to perform an absolute finality, to ensure that the woman who had witnessed his point of failure was sufficiently silenced by the weight of his shadow. In his world, a witness to weakness was a fatal detail that had to be deleted. "You performed a clinical sabotage of my authority, Miss Moyo," he whispered, the words carrying a low vibration of danger. "You forced an emergency landing that cost my family millions and signaled to every wolf in my territory that the Iron Architect could be brought to his knees by a simple heart murmur. You didn't just save a life. You created a liability." "I saved a human being," Angela countered, her waitress's eye for detail noting the slight pallor still clinging to his skin despite his god-complex posture. "The millions you lost are a grit and grease variable. Your pulse is a fact. If you want to punish me for prioritizing the fact over the variable, then your anatomy of power is far more fragile than I thought." Hyan-Woo leaned into her personal space, a shadow behind the curtain, finally stepping into the light. He intended to terrify her, to see the rhythmic tension of fear break her resolve. But as he drew closer, he didn't find terror. He found a sovereign strength that mirrored his own. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at a subordinate or a rival. He was looking at an unburdened spirit. The audit of the situation he had intended to perform on her bravery suddenly shifted. It became an audit of the heart. He saw the small silver cross at her throat, a legacy of silence and faith. He saw the way she didn't blink when he loomed over her. He realized that she wasn't staying silent out of fear, but out of a sovereign choice. "Why didn't you look away?" he asked, his voice losing its edge of icy malice and becoming a low, obsessed hum. "In the cabin when I told you I was fine, when I tried to crush you with a glance. Why did you press?" "Because my father didn't have someone like me in his seat when his heart failed," Angela replied, her voice softening but remaining iron-forged. "I made a promise that I would never let another man become a ghost in a chair because he was too proud to admit he was dying. I don't care about your Mafia signals, Hyan-Woo. I cared about the man who was rubbing his left arm." The silence that followed was no longer a hospital noose. It was a calculating quiet, where the power dynamic of their worlds performed a total status inversion. Hyan-Woo looked at the woman he had intended to silence and felt a shadow's reflex of something he hadn't felt in decades: respect. He reached out, his hand, marked with a dragon tattoo that signaled his anatomy of power, hovering just inches from her chin. It wasn't a threat of violence, but a sovereign protection gesture. "You saved the Iron Architect, Angela," he murmured, his gaze becoming a precision instrument of fascination. "And in doing so, you've claimed a sovereign debt that I cannot repay with money. You think you are still a flight attendant heading back to your life. You aren't. The moment you touched my arm, you became the only variable in this world that I cannot delete." He stepped back, the lethal calm returning, but the god complex had been permanently altered. He had come to silence a witness. He was leaving with a reckoning in his soul. As he walked toward the door, he didn't look back, but the signals were clear. The anatomy of a lie was over. Angela Moyo was no longer his cargo. She was his destiny. The calculating quiet of the Valente penthouse in Seoul was not a sanctuary. It was a pressurized chamber of icy malice. While Hyan-Woo remained in a state of forced recovery, the signals of his empire began to flicker like dying stars. In the sublevels of the syndicate's central hub, Sang-Jun moved with the lethal calm of a predator who had finally scented blood in the water. He didn't need a weapon to initiate a status collapse. He only needed the truth of what had happened 30,000 feet above Denver. Sang-Jun stood before the High Council, his silhouette a sharp, iron-forged shadow against the floor-to-ceiling glass. He held a tablet, a precision instrument of betrayal, displaying the flight logs and the emergency medical report from the Denver hospital. The anatomy of a lie that Hyan-Woo was an invincible, unshakable architect was being dismantled in real time before the very men who funded his vision. The Iron Architect has developed a crack, Sang-Jun began, his voice a low vibration of clinical sabotage. He didn't just suffer a medical lapse. He allowed a commoner, a flight attendant from a world of grit and grease, to dictate the terms of his survival. He allowed a woman to perform an audit of his weakness and live to tell the tale. A heavy, chilling pale gray silence settled over the council. In their world, power was a binary code. You were either a sovereign or you were a liability. There was no room for the immovable grace of mercy. Sang-Jun watched the signals of doubt register on the elders' faces, his own god complex expanding to fill the vacuum Hyan-Woo had left behind. While Hyan-Woo lingers in the hospital news of his own making, our rivals are already circling. Sang-Jun continued, his eyes glowing with a shadow's reflex of greed. They see a leader who can be brought to his knees by his own heart. They see a variable that can be deleted. If we do not perform an absolute finality on his leadership now, the entire Valente legacy will face a status collapse that none of us will survive. Across the city, unaware of the signals being broadcast against him, Hyan-Woo sat in his private study, his hand instinctively moving to his chest. The rhythmic tension of his recovery was being interrupted by a new, cold realization. His secure lines were silent. The disciplined vigilance of his usual guards had been replaced by unfamiliar faces. The anatomy of power he had spent a decade building was being rerouted. Sunung entered the room, his face a mask of wide-eyed exhaustion. He didn't need to speak for Hyan-Woo to understand the audit of the situation. Sang-Jun has moved, Sunung whispered, his voice a deep, agonizing crack in the room's silence. He is liquidating your loyalists. He has framed the emergency landing as a paper gamble you lost. He's painting Angela Moyo as the witness who must be eliminated to restore our honor. Hyan-Woo stood, his lethal calm, returning with a terrifying intensity. He looked at the dragon tattoo on his arm, the mark of a sovereign, and felt the slow-burn tension of a cornered wolf. Sang-Jun thought he was witnessing a status collapse, but he had forgotten that an architect knows how to tear down a building just as well as he knows how to build one. He thinks I am a shattered icon, Hyan-Woo murmured, his gaze turning as sharp as a precision instrument. He thinks the flight attendant is a weakness. He doesn't realize she is the only reason I am still breathing to finish this reckoning. The calculating quiet of the house was now a battlefield. The hospital noose was off, and as Sang-Jun finalized the clinical sabotage of his brother's life, Hyan-Woo began to draft a new blueprint, one where the Iron Architect didn't just return, but performed a status inversion that would leave the syndicate in ashes. The signals of betrayal were loud, but the reckoning would be silent. The calculating quiet of Denver had officially curdled into a chilling pale gray trap. Angela was leaving the crew hotel, her mind performing a weary audit of her flight hours, when the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't the wind, it was the rhythmic tension of black SUVs jumping the curb, their tires screaming against the asphalt like a brake line parachment. Before she could retreat, the icy malice of Sang-Jun's reach manifested in the form of three men stepping from the vehicles, their silenced weapons raised with a lethal calm. They didn't see a woman. They saw a fatal detail that needed to be deleted to finalize Hyan-Woo's status collapse. Angela froze, a vulnerable giant caught in the crosshairs of a war she hadn't started, her heart hammering a prayer she had learned in Harare. Get down. The command didn't come from the gunman. It was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to anchor the very earth. From the shadows of the hotel portico, Hyan-Woo emerged, moving with a shadow's reflex that defied his recent medical trauma. He didn't look like a recovering patient. He looked like the Iron Architect reclaiming his sight. In one fluid motion, he closed the distance between them, his body becoming a literal iron shield as he shoved Angela toward the reinforced concrete pillar of the entrance. The first cough of a silenced round chipped the stone inches from her head, but Hyan-Woo didn't flinch. He stood between her and the lead, his expensive silk shirt snapping in the winter wind, the top buttons torn open to reveal the dark, intricate ink of the dragon tattoo that spiraled up his chest and around his throat, the mark of a sovereign who did not permit trespass. "Stay behind me," he growled, his voice a precision instrument of authority. As the gunman advanced, Hyan-Woo engaged. It wasn't the frantic scrap of a desperate man, but a clinical sabotage of their momentum. He moved within their guard, his strikes landing with absolute finality. He broke a wrist here, a larynx there, his movements a disciplined vigilance turned outward. Even with his heart still healing, his god complex provided a terrifying fuel. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was protecting the only person who had ever looked at him and seen a man instead of an empire. Angela watched from the shadows, her waitress's eye for detail catching the way Hyan-Woo winced, his hand momentarily pressing against his sternum as the slow-burn tension of the exertion taxed his recovering valve. Yet he never broke the line. He remained her iron shield, absorbing the danger, his presence a sovereign protection that turned the hotel driveway into a graveyard for Sang-Jun's ambitions. The final gunman leveled his weapon, but a sharp crack from the hotel rooftop ended the threat. Sunung stood there, his rifle providing the audit of the situation from above. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized by the grit and grease of the violence that had just unfolded. Hyan-Woo turned back to Angela, his breathing heavy, the dragon on his chest seeming to pulse with every ragged inhalation. His lethal calm was frayed at the edges, revealing the vulnerable giant beneath the ink. He reached out his hand, stained with the dust of the struggle, stopping just short of her face. "I told you," he whispered, the words carrying an absolute finality. "You are no longer a bystander. They saw you save me. Now, they will try to use you to break me." Angela looked at the dragon tattoo, then at the man who had just stood in front of a bullet for her. The invisibility by design she had lived by for years was utterly incinerated. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was the heart of a reckoning. "We can't stay here," Hyan-Woo said, his gaze performing a rapid audit of the perimeter. "Sang-Jun has turned the signals against us. Denver is no longer safe. Where are we going?" Angela asked, her voice possessing an immovable grace that surprised even him. "To the only place where the Iron Architect still has a foundation," he replied, taking her hand. "To the dark." The safe house was a sanctuary of grit and grease, a far cry from the chandeliered altar of the Valente penthouse. Tucked into the industrial underbelly of the city, the air inside smelled of stale oil and cold concrete, a calculating quiet that felt heavy with a scent of ozone and old secrets. Sunung moved with disciplined vigilance, his fingers flying across an encrypted terminal as he rerouted the signals of their location to lead Sang-Jun's hunters into a digital maze. He was the sentinel of their survival, his eyes never leaving the monitors that flickered with the grainy feeds of the perimeter. In the center of the room, Hyan-Woo sat on a worn leather chair, his lethal calm finally beginning to fray at the edges. He had stripped off his blood-stained shirt, revealing the full anatomy of power inked across his skin, the dragon coiled around his ribs, its scales shimmering in the dim light. But beneath the ink, his chest moved with a shallow, ragged rhythm. The iron shield had taken a toll on his recovering heart, and as he leaned back, Angela saw the vulnerable giant for the first time. The man who had been the Iron Architect of 1,000 deaths was now a man struggling for a single, unburdened breath. Angela moved toward him, her waitress's eye for detail catching the slight tremor in his hand. She didn't ask for permission. She simply knelt beside him, her immovable grace acting as a stabilizing force in the chaotic room. She reached out, her cool fingers pressing gently against the pulse point at his throat. "Your heart is racing," she whispered, her voice a precision instrument of concern. "The exertion, you shouldn't have moved like that." Hyan-Woo looked down at her, his chilling pale gray, eyes clouded with a mix of exhaustion and a slow-burn tension. He tried to summon his god complex to pull back into the shadows of his legend, but the pain in his chest performed a clinical sabotage on his pride. He let out a sharp wince, his hand moving to grip hers, not to push her away, but to anchor himself. "It was necessary," he growled, though the sound was more of a deep, agonizing crack than a command. "Sang-Jun believes he can initiate a status collapse by targeting you. He thinks you are a variable he can delete to break the Iron Architect. He doesn't understand that you are the only variable I will not lose." Angela didn't look away. She saw the sweat beading on his hairline, the way the dragon on his chest seemed to pulse with his labored breathing. She saw the man who had been her iron shield, and realized that the anatomy of a lie went both ways. He wasn't just a monster. He was a man who had built a fortress around himself to keep the world out, only to find himself trapped inside the hospital noose of his own making. "In my world," Angela said, her voice remaining iron-forged and steady, "we don't protect people because they are assets. We protect them because they are alive. You keep trying to turn me into a variable, Hyan-Woo, but I'm just a woman who doesn't want to see you die." Sun-Young looked up from the terminal, his gaze performing an audit of the situation as he watched the interaction. He had served the Valente family for a decade, witnessing the icy malice and the lethal calm, but he had never seen the Iron Architect allow a commoner to see the grit and grease of his soul. The signals of betrayal were everywhere, but in this room, a new sovereign alliance was being drafted, one based not on power, but on a shared, primal desperation for survival. "The perimeter is clear for now," Sun-Young announced, his voice breaking the calculating quiet. "But Sang-Jun is liquidating the last of the loyalists. We can't stay in the shadows forever. The reckoning has to be public." Hyan-Woo looked back at Angela, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. The lethal calm returned to his eyes, but it was tempered by a sovereign respect he hadn't possessed before the flight. "Then we go to the gala," Hyan-Woo murmured, the words carrying an absolute finality. "We perform a status inversion that he won't survive. He thinks he is witnessing my status collapse. He has no idea that the Iron Architect is just beginning his final build." Angela stood, her physical ascent into his world now complete. She wasn't just the woman from Seat 1A anymore. She was the Architect's partner, and together, they were heading toward a reckoning that would leave the city in ashes. The chandeliered altar of the Valente ancestral estate in Seoul was a masterpiece of icy malice and filtered ambition. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the calculating quiet of men waiting to see which way the wind of power would blow. Sang-Jun stood at the center of the ballroom, his silhouette a sharp, iron-forged shadow against the gold-leafed walls. He was holding court, his god complex fully inflated as he prepared to finalize the status collapse of his brother. He spoke in low, rhythmic tones of necessary transitions and the unfortunate fragility of the previous administration, unaware that the signals of his own ruin were already being broadcasted. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the hall didn't just open. They were struck by an absolute finality. Hyan-Woo stepped into the light, his lethal calm, acting as a pressurized weight that instantly drained the noise from the room. He was no longer the vulnerable giant clutching a hospital bed. He was the Iron Architect in a charcoal suit that fit with precision over the dragon coiled around his heart. Beside him, Angela Moya walked with an immovable grace that made every head in the room turn. She wore a gown of deep midnight silk, her presence a status inversion that the family's board of directors couldn't comprehend. She wasn't a hostage and she wasn't a witness to be silenced. She was a sovereign ally. "You're late for your own funeral, Sang-Jun," Hyan-Woo said, his voice a low vibration that carried the anatomy of power through the vast space. Sang-Jun's face went a chilling pale gray, his shadow's reflex causing his hand to twitch toward his waist. But the room had already shifted. Sunung emerged from the perimeter, his disciplined vigilance, backed by a dozen men who had seen the audit of the situation and realized their true loyalty lay with the man who had survived death, not the one who had tried to manufacture it. "The clinical sabotage you planned in Denver was a paper gamble you lost," Hyan-Woo continued, his gaze performing a cold audit of his brother's fear. "You thought my heart attack was a point of failure. You didn't realize it was a physical ascent. It stripped away the grit and grease of this life and showed me exactly who is worth the air in their lungs." Hyan-Woo walked to the center of the floor, his presence so commanding that the High Council stepped back in disciplined vigilance. He looked at the dragon-tattooed men, the architects of a legacy built on blood, and then he looked at Angela. "I didn't come here to reclaim a throne that is rotting from within," Hyan-Woo announced, the words falling like heavy silk into the pressurized silence. "I came to announce my absolute finality with the Valente name. The Iron Architect is retiring. The assets have been rerouted. The signals have been cut. I am leaving this cathedral of icy malice to the wolves you've spent your life feeding." A collective gasp rippled through the room, a status collapse of the organization's very foundation. To leave the life was a fatal detail that usually ended in a coffin, but Hyan-Woo held the room with a lethal calm that dared anyone to enforce the rule. He had performed a clinical sabotage on the very idea of the Mafia, choosing an impossible peace over a crown of thorns. "You're a dead man," Sang-Jun hissed, his voice a deep, agonizing crack of desperation. "No," Hyan-Woo replied, taking Angela's hand, his touch a sovereign seal of his new reality. "I am finally a living one. You can have the ghost of this empire, Sang-Jun. I'm taking the life she gave back to me." As they turned to leave the chandeliered altar, the calculating quiet returned, but it was no longer heavy with threat. It was the silence of a vacuum created by a legend walking away. Angela felt the rhythmic tension in Hyan-Woo's grip, but she also felt the unburdened strength of a man who had finally completed his physical ascent. The reckoning was over. The sovereign legacy was about to begin. The calculating quiet of the estate's private courtyard was heavy with the scent of rain and cold stone, a pressurized vacuum where the final variable of the Valente legacy waited to be deleted. Sang-Jun lay on the damp pavement, his god complex shattered into a jagged mess of primal desperation. He had been cornered by the very men he thought he had bought, a clinical sabotage of his coup that had left him with nowhere to run. Above him stood Hyan-Woo, the Iron Architect, looking down with a lethal calm that promised an absolute finality. In Hyan-Woo's right hand was a precision instrument, a cold, black steel sidearm that glinted under the chilling pale gray moonlight. The air hummed with a rhythmic tension, the silent board of directors watching from the shadows of the veranda, waiting for the blood that usually closed a status collapse in their world. One pull of the trigger would satisfy the grit and grease of their code. It would end the icy malice Sang-Jun had unleashed in Denver and Seoul. Angela stood a few paces behind Hyan-Woo, her immovable grace, a stark contrast to the violence trembling in the air. She didn't speak, didn't plead. She simply watched with a waitress's eye for detail, noting the way Hyan-Woo's finger tightened against the trigger guard. She knew he was performing a final audit of the heart. He was deciding if he would leave this life as the monster they expected or the man she had saved. "Do it," Sang-Jun hissed, his voice a deep, agonizing crack of defiance. "Finish the anatomy of power, brother. Show them the Iron Architect still knows how to kill." Hyan-Woo leveled the weapon, the dragon on his chest seeming to coil and tighten under his silk shirt. The hospital noose, of his past was pulling him toward the old ways, the cycle of ruin that had defined his family for generations. But as he looked at Sang-Jun, he didn't see a rival. He saw a shattered icon of a life he no longer wanted. He felt the phantom pulse of Angela's hand on his arm from seat 1A, the touch that had performed a clinical sabotage on his soul. To kill you would be a paper gamble I've already won, Hyan-Woo murmured, his voice a low vibration of sovereign authority. It would be an admission that I am still part of your cathedral of icy malice. But I am not an architect of death anymore. With a slow, deliberate motion, Hyan-Woo engaged the safety and handed the weapon to Sun-Ung. The calculating quiet broke as a collective breath was released by the onlookers. This wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a status inversion of their entire culture. You are exiled, Sang-Jun, Hyan-Woo stated, the words carrying the weight of absolute finality. The accounts in your name have been liquidated. Your signals are dead. You will be delivered to the coast and put on a vessel that does not return to these shores. You will live the rest of your days as a ghost in the shades of gray, forgotten by the empire you tried to steal. Sang-Jun looked up, his wide-eyed exhaustion meeting Hyan-Woo's lethal calm. To a man obsessed with power, exile was a slower, more agonizing death than a bullet. It was a permanent status collapse, without the dignity of a martyr's end. The audit is closed, Hyan-Woo said, turning his back on his brother. He walked toward Angela, his physical ascent into a new world finally complete. He didn't look at the council or the guards. He looked only at the woman who had stood as his iron shield in the darkness. As they walked away from the courtyard, leaving the grit and grease of the Mafia behind, Hyan-Woo felt a lightness in his chest that no medical procedure could have provided. He had chosen restraint over ruin, and for the first time in his life, his heart beat with a rhythm that was entirely, beautifully unburdened. The calculating quiet of the high-altitude world had been replaced by the rhythmic, grounded hum of a life built on solid earth. Years had passed since the absolute finality of Hyan-Woo's departure from Seoul, yet the transition into an impossible peace felt as fresh as the morning air in their small coastal garden. The Iron Architect had traded his obsidian towers for the simple, structured beauty of a life unburdened by the grit and grease of the underworld. He sat on the porch, his lethal calm, now softened into a state of profound, unburdened presence, his dark eyes watching the horizon with a peace that no Mafia crown could ever buy. Angela moved through the kitchen, her immovable grace, as steady as the day she had faced a failing heart 30,000 feet above Denver. She was no longer a ghost in a blue uniform, navigating the shades of gray of a service life. She was a woman who had performed a clinical sabotage on a man's destiny and, in doing so, had found her own. Her waitress's eye for detail, once used to catch the signals of a heart attack, now noted the way the sun caught the silver in Hyan-Woo's hair and the relaxed posture of a man who no longer feared the shadow's reflex of a hidden enemy. "The tea is getting cold," she said, her voice a precision instrument of warmth that pulled him back from his thoughts. Hyan-Woo looked up, a slow, genuine smile breaking through his iron-forged exterior. He reached out, his hand, still bearing the faded ink of the dragon, taking hers with a sovereign gentleness. The anatomy of power they shared now wasn't built on fear or leverage. It was built on the audit of the heart they performed every day. He wasn't just a man she had saved. He was the reason she had finally allowed herself to stop running and start living. "I was thinking about the flight," Hyan-Woo murmured, his voice a low vibration of sovereign gratitude. "How I tried to silence you with a look, thinking you were just a variable I could delete. I didn't realize you were the iron shield I'd been waiting for my entire life." "You were a difficult patient," Angela teased, her eyes shining with an unburdened light. "But even then, through all that icy malice, I could see the vulnerable giant who just wanted a reason to breathe." The hospital news of their past, the threats from Sang-Jun, the status collapse of the Valente legacy, and the grit and grease of the Denver safe house felt like a dream from another lifetime. They had architected a new legacy, one far removed from the cathedral of icy malice, Hyan-Woo had once called home. Here, the only reckoning was the change of the seasons, and the only signals were the laughter of the neighbors and the sound of the tide. Hyan-Woo pulled her closer, his head resting against her shoulder. For years, he had been the Iron Architect, building a world that didn't forgive weakness. But Angela had shown him that restraint over ruin was the ultimate form of strength. She had saved his life in Seat 1A, but the true physical ascent had been his journey toward the man he was now, a man who finally had a reason to live the life she had given back to him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a chandeliered glow across their quiet corner of the world, they sat in a silence that was no longer calculating, but complete. The anatomy of a lie was gone. There were no more ghosts, no more paper gambles. Just a woman who had dared to care, and a man who had been brave enough to be saved. Their impossible peace was no longer a dream. It was the sovereign truth of their lives. The educational value of this awesome story teaches that true leadership and character are defined by the courage to prioritize human life over rigid protocols or intimidation. Angela's decision to force an emergency landing despite Hyan-Woo's God-complex and professional threats demonstrates that moral agency is a higher calling than mere job descriptions. It encourages individuals to act on their intuition and values, even when facing powerful opposition. She proves that one does not need to be aggressive to be powerful. This highlights that staying grounded in one's truth acts as an iron shield against psychological manipulation and fear. The narrative performs an audit of what true power looks like. Initially, power is presented as Hyan-Woo's wealth, violence, and secrecy. I see malice. However, the story reveals this to be a hospital noose that isolates him. The real power is discovered in restraint over ruin, the ability to walk away from a corrupt legacy to build an impossible peace. The story explores the sociological concept of the invisible worker. Angela, a flight attendant, is initially seen only as a service variable. Her physical ascent into a sovereign partner teaches that every person carries a hidden depth and capability, the vulnerable giant, that can change the course of history if given the chance to speak and act. A significant educational takeaway is the focus on legacy architecture. Both characters move from a past of grit and grease and tragedy toward a future that is unburdened. The story teaches that while we cannot choose our origins, we have the power to perform a clinical sabotage on our family's toxic patterns to ensure the next generation grows up in peace. Finally, the story highlights the concept of unpayable debt. Hyan-Woo's transformation proves that a life saved creates a connection that transcends culture, class, and crime. It teaches that empathy is a precision instrument that can dismantle even the most hardened hearts, turning a dangerous mistake into a life-changing miracle. Stay blessed, like and subscribe for the next twist.